Good morning. Welcome to the Morning Momentum this Monday morning. I am Alfonsoh Ouma. This is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Let's take a look at a comprehensive rundown of the top stories making the headlines on the papers today. And we kickstart our session with the Standard newspaper. The top story here is, "This is our agenda." Whereas President William Ruto and Azimio leader Raila Odinga have been the faces of the bipartisan talk, Kenyans from all walks of life are also having their say. The committee is receiving memorandum that will be considered in their final report. That story is beefed up for you on page 2. On page 9, why push for new counties will not be a walk in the park. We'll take a look at that story. Also on page 21, Morocco quake toll at 2,000. That story is beefed up for you under world news. On sports news, we'll take a look at Coco Gauff's rise and rise in tennis. That story is on page 20. Also health and science, why you will be able to grow teeth again. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Business news, dollar zooms past 150 shillings, piles pressure on shilling. That story is beefed up for you on page 19. Let's take a look at the stories inside the Standard this morning. On page 2, police brutality delayed justice top agenda as team resumes talks. Issues raised include extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearance. Petitioners will not be required to publicly defend their submissions. That story is beefed up for you on page 2 of the Standard this morning. On page 3, a drinking den that's now churning out adult scholars. For 16 years, the Adult Education Center has refined the literacy of hundreds of grown-ups who never went to school in their childhood. Pioneer learners have furthered their studies in colleges and universities. That story is beefed up for you on page 3 of the Standard this morning. On page 4, rich nations paying lip service to Africa on climate crisis for years. COP16 set a global to mobilize $100 billion per year in climate finance from rich countries. Now, over a decade later, this commitment has turned out to be an empty pledge. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 of the Standard this morning. On page 5, Highways Agency unclogs drainage ahead of El Nino. Kenya National Highways Authority has also identified key roads in other parts of the country prone to flooding. The primary drainage system responsible for collecting water from both sides of Mombasa Road converges at Imara Daima. That story is beefed up for you on page 5. Let's take a look at page 6. 5 rebels face ODM acts that built and destroyed political careers. Their future appears uncertain as they seek to defend off ODM's attempts to disseminate their political careers. ODM has nurtured and dashed numerous political careers since its inception 18 years ago. Among the leaders that are facing the ODM acts are Felix Odiwuor, Lang'ata MP. We have Tom Ojienda, Kisumu Senator, and Gideon Ochanda, Bondo Member of Parliament. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. Let's take a look at page 7. Review law, let the president pick councillors, Education Ministry. Machogu said governance issues have adversely affected the performance of universities. Universities are grappling with a debt exceeding 62 billion shillings, rendering them unable to settle payments. That story is beefed up for you on page 7 of the Standard this morning. On page 8, Sugar Belt leaders want states to emulate private millers' efficiency. Private factories are lauded for paying farmers weekly and competitively as opposed to struggling government-owned millers. Now, leaders want a special fund set aside for Ken development at least for 2 years. That story is beefed up for you on page 8. On page 9, tough road ahead to create more counties. Experts say an independent commission must be formed for the purpose of moving around and gathering views. Proposal must be supported by 2/3 of members of the National Assembly and the Senate. That story is beefed up for you on page 9 of the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at the expert opinion. Should the number of counties be increased to 58? Now, we have Jane Waithera, who is a university student, says yes, it will greatly boost service delivery. On the contrary, Morgan Wanyonyi, also a university student, says no, move will worsen graft and bring more inefficiency. You can catch up with that story on page 13. Still under expert opinion, better funding and management is what education sector needs. Now, the Kenyan public education sector is financed through taxes and payment of fees by parents, guardians, private firms, and international donor agencies. Free primary education funds and free day secondary education allocations are either delayed or allocated in small bits that cannot afford schools to carry out their programs. You can catch up with that story on page 14. Let's take a look at health and science. What pesticide is in your stew, whether you source your vegetables from the market or straight from a farmer? The vegetables in your cooking pot are 46.5% likely to have pesticide residues. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5 of the health science article. Now, let's take a look at the Planet Action this morning. Now, drought summit exposes rising suicides in Maasai community. Experts underscored the significant role climate change is playing in mental illness, triggering depression and confusion among the Ma community. You can catch up with that story on page 17 of the Standard this morning. Also, how climate debt hurts poor nations. In the face of increased climate crisis, there is a growing concern about climate debt, a term that highlights the unequal burden shouldered by the most vulnerable developing countries. That story is also beefed up for you on page 17. Let's take a look at business news on the Standard this morning. Dollar zooms past 150 shillings as pressure piles on local currency. Shilling has fallen to new lows as demand for greenback continues to rise. President Ruto to launch new CBK portal for securities trading today. You can catch up with that story on page 19. Matters aviation, airlines near pre-COVID level association. Africa Airlines traffic in the month of August 2023 reached 98.4% of the 2019 level. A report by the Africa Airlines Association has indicated. You can catch up with that story on page 19 of the business news. Let's now shift gears to the international news. We go to Uganda now. Uganda issues first Islamic banking license. The Bank of Uganda, the country's central bank, issued an Islamic banking license to Salam Bank Group in Kampala on Friday. In attendance was Deputy Governor Michael Ating Ego and Salam CEO Mohammed Ali. You can catch up with that story on page 21. In Morocco, earthquake death toll rises to 2,000, thousands hurt. Now, the heaviest casualties are in provinces just south of Marrakesh. King Mohammed VI declared 3 days of a national mourning. That story is beefed up for you on page 21. Matters diplomacy. G20 accepts Africa bloc as a new member. The group of G20 members agreed Saturday to accept the African Union as a new member in an effort to give a greater voice and more representation to developing countries. That story is beefed up for you on page 21. On page 22, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the man who divided South Africa. During the transition to multi-party democracy, Buthelezi feared the erosion of his power. He served as a minister for home affairs for a decade. You can catch up with that story on page 22. Let's now take a look at another top story right here. 30 fighting days left for Ukraine's offensive. That is the USA. General Mark Milley says the offensive had gone more slowly than expected. He says it is too early to say whether the counter-offensive has failed. You can catch up with that story on page 23. Let's shift gears to sports news. On the Standard this morning, Coco Gauff rise to her first Grand Slam title at US Open. American teenager beats Ariana Sabalenka to win US Open title. Coco Gauff bursts into the scene as a 15-year-old at the Wimbledon Open in 2019. You can catch up with that story on page 29 of the Standard this morning. Also on rugby, Okwiri keeps his world title dream alive with win at Nyayo. Kenya wins WABA Africa Supreme Middleweight title after flooring Tanzania's Makawa. His dream has always been to win a world title before hanging his gloves. That story is beefed up for you on page 30. On golf, Okech rules at Railway Club as Kamau wins in Mombasa course. Pair of Villamizar and Kwame Parker win young and youthful tournament at Limuru Club. Okech emerges overall winner of the Western Jazz Tourney as Kamau wins a sorted event. That story is beefed up for you on page 31. Let's take a look at some football. North Macedonia hound Italy again in Euro qualifying match. Italy again suffered at the hands of North Macedonia as their poor start to European Championship qualifying continued with a shock 1-1 draw in Skopje. Also, Germany coach Flick sacked after defeat. You can catch up with that story on page 31. On the cover page, still rugby, KCB show their power in final badge as they regain 7th circuit title. Cabra's Sugar finished second after 5th place finish at Kabeberi tournament. The Bankers also won the Kabeberi 7th title yesterday after beating Nakuru 24-0. You can catch up with that story on the cover page. And lastly, athletics, Ngetich breaks world 10-kilometer record in Brasov. Kenya's Agnes Ngetich broke the women-only world 10-kilometer record at the Transylvania 10-kilometer, clocking 29:24 at the World Athletics Elite Label Road race held yesterday as part of the Brasov Running Festival in Romania. You can catch up with that story on the cover page of the Standard this morning. Let's take a quick break, and then we come back with the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation. Keep watching Younib TV. Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. If you are just joining us, you are still rolling with the host with the most. Alfonsoh Ouma is my name. Now, let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation this morning. 48 hours of drama at Bomas. President William Ruto is marking 1 year in office this week. This anniversary, as a tense and anxious nation waited for the announcement of their next president, the National Tallying Center in Nairobi was receiving visitors with various requests to IEBC Chairman Wafula Chebukati and his team. But the events of August 14th and 15th were possibly the defining moments of the election. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5. Also, President Ruto, why I want official opposition leader post. You can catch up with that story on page 6. Sorry. Also, more under 50s getting early cancer diagnosis and deaths, say study. Diets high in red meat, low in fruit, high in sodium, and low in milk, as well as alcohol and tobacco consumptions, are the main risk factors for early onset cancer, say researchers. That story is beefed up for you on page 11. On page 10, blow to non-local teachers in NEP and as TSC declines transfer request. That story is beefed up for you on page 10. International news, how Vuvuzela toy turned a family's life upside down. We'll take a look at that story inside the Daily Nation. Now, let's take a look at page 2, how Uhuru ICC case shook the Kenyatta family and changed me. Not so long after we had settled into our jobs, something happened that tormented me and my family. ICC prosecutor opened an envelope revealing names of persons he claimed bore greatest responsibility in the 2007-2008 violence. In the penultimate installment of this exclusive 4-part serialization of Beth Mugo's autobiography, she reveals behind-the-scenes details around the 2007 elections and the deadly political violence that followed, and how she handled the charging of her cousin Uhuru Kenyatta at the ICC before the case was withdrawn. That story is beefed up for you on page 2 and page 3 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 4, 48 hours of anxiety and high drama for IEBC chiefs at Bomas before the announcement of William Ruto as the winner of the August 9, 2022 elections. A lot had happened at the National Tallying Center. The security team said an announcement of William Ruto as president was unacceptable and claimed IEBC would take the blame for plunging the country into chaos. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at page 6. Ruto keen on opposition leader office. President says he has no problem with the opposition checking his government through peaceful means. Deputy President Gachagua demands that 2022 polls audit be dropped from bipartisan talks team agenda. You can take a look at that story on page 6 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 7, stop taking over counties' functions. Raila tells Ruto. President is luring opposition leaders to his side, claims Azimio boss. That story is beefed up for you on page 7. Let's take a look at page 8, how Vuvuzela toy turned family's life upside down. Now, Liam had hardly enjoyed his new toy when tragedy struck, throwing the family into a spin. A boy 5 is set to undergo a second surgery in a flesh attempt to remove the cap that is logged in his lungs. You can catch up with that story on page 8. Let's take a look at page 10. TSC declines to transfer tutors from the north. Teachers have been camping at TSC headquarters demanding transfer over insecurity. Employer warns of disciplinary action against teachers. That story is beefed up for you on page 10 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 11, study, more people under 50 getting cancer diagnosis. For young people, scientists indicate that being obese is the biggest contributor to cancer. That story is beefed up for you on page 11. Let's move on to some expert opinion. Now, before reforms, let's have sober audit of constitution. We should be careful not to engage in a mob patchwork of defacing the Supreme law. That is a sentiment by Gitile Naituli. You can catch up with that story on page 14. Let's move to page 15. Electric cars can't run on blackouts. The government would rather apportion blame on junior officials than deal with the monkey business. That is a sentiment by Kaltum D. Guyo, Clean Energy. Let's move on to page 16. Teachers should form professional body. The recently released report of the Presidential Working Party on Education Reforms was spot on by proposing that all teachers need a serious umbrella professional body to cater for their professional needs. You can catch up with that story on page 16. Top 40 under 40 men, that is an article inside the Daily Nation you want to catch up with now. You claimed your role as alpha and shattered expectations. It is time to get recognized. You can catch up with that article on page 17. Let's move on to county news. Now, alarm over ganging attack county government critiques, that is in Uasin Gishu. Governor accuses sacked officers of soiling administration's image. Also in Kisumu County, lobby demands action on rising insecurity. That story is beefed up for you on page 18. In Kericho County, EACC starts probe into claims of funds theft at water farm. Now, also shape up or ship out. Gachagua warns bickering county leaders. That story is beefed up for you on page 19. Let's move on to international news. Morocco mourns quake victims as death toll climbs past 2,000. The kingdom has declared 3 days of national mourning. Rescue teams race to find survivors trapped under the rubble of flattened villages. That story is beefed up for you on page 20 of the Daily Nation this morning. On the DN2 article, Higher Education Honors Gallery, you can catch up with that story on page 1 of the DN2 article. Let's move on to some other story inside the Daily Nation this morning. Let's see what we have right here. It's still the Higher Education article. You can catch up with it inside the Daily Nation. I think we should now move to some sports news inside the Daily Nation this morning. Let's see what we have on the sports news. Now we start with athletics. Learning to experience for Kangogo in Berlin Marathon set for September 24th. We'll take a look at that on page 40. Now, US Open Tennis, Gauff pays tribute to Williams' sisters. They have allowed me to believe in this dream. Teen star says icons Serena Venus inspired her to win her first Grand Slam title. You can catch up with that story on page 36 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 37, regular practice pays off for golfer Cuthbert at Nation Classic tourney. Home player delighted to win at Eldoret Sports Club for the first time, says victory will enhance her chances as she strives to lower her handicap. That story is beefed up for you on page 37. On page 38, Egypt face Cameroon test as Big Four clash in Cairo. High stakes Kenya take on Senegal in 9th to 15th place semi-final classification match. You can catch up with that story on page 38. On page 39, BMW Berlin Marathon. You can catch up with that story on page 39. And lastly, on the cover page, a learning experience for Kangogo. I will not be after beating Kipchoge, but I will be challenging my peers, says the soft-spoken athlete from Moiben. Stellarcast world record holder Eliud Kipchoge will be seeking to defend his title in September 24th race. Also, Kenya's Ngetich sets new 10-kilometer world record in Romania. World cross-country bronze medalist Agnes Ngetich broke the 10 kilometers women-only record at the Brasov Running Festival in Romania yesterday. Now, with that story of Ngetich, we come to a conclusion of today's episode of The Morning Momentum. Many thanks for keeping watching this show. Continue interacting with us via our SMS line 0719144144. Remember to follow us across all our socials at Younib_TV on Instagram, Younib Media TV on Facebook, and on YouTube. Many thanks to all those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa, Kavira. See you tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, do have a beautiful Monday. Bye-bye.